This happened to me during my first year of grad school. I was broke at the time. Well, still am thanks to student loan debt. And I would take on dog sitting gigs for some extra cash. One of my professors hired me to stay the long weekend at his house while he was away at a conference. My main responsibilities were to take care of the dog, a Scottish Terrier named Teddy, and not to make any messes. The house was on the outskirts of our little university town in a sort of wooded subdivision. Most of the homes there were old brick ranchers built in the 1980s. It seemed like every other lot in the community was empty. There'd be a house, then an empty lot with trees and tall grass in it, then another lot with a house, then a lot with trees. Kind of like a checkerboard pattern. Not gonna lie, it was a little bit unsettling. Though I didn't realize that at the time. But, on the other hand, it was a great neighborhood for walking a dog. Teddy and I were both night owls. He kept me company while I was studying or watching TV late at night, and he also didn't bother me to go potty early in the morning because we both liked to sleep in. I stayed from Thursday night through Monday evening. I didn't have a class on Friday, and Monday was a school holiday. On Thursday night, I established a ritual of taking Teddy out for a long walk well after midnight. This was our favorite walk of the day. For Teddy, it meant exploring the neighborhood and sniffing for critters that aren't normally out at a decent hour. And it gave me an opportunity to smoke a joint in peace. I was a huge stoner that semester. We did a loop around the whole neighborhood. It was about a mile and a half when it was all said and done. And Teddy was always ready for bed when we got home. There was an empty house about halfway down the block. It looked slightly newer than all the others, but it also looked as though no one had lived there in quite some time. There was a sign in the yard advertising an open house, but the date on the sign was about 2 years in the past. Now, Teddy is a sniffer, and always had to check out all the smells in all the lawns. But not this house. Whenever we got to the empty house, he'd stop sniffing and trot his little ass up to the next lot. The lot next door was completely wooded and like a jungle, so there was a lot to hold the dog's interest and plenty of soft grass to go potty on. On my last night dog sitting, I took Teddy out on his walk later than usual, between 1:30 and 1:45 a.m. I just finished writing the first draft of a big research paper and decided to celebrate by smoking the rest of the herb I'd gotten for the week. I wouldn't be able to smoke again until the following weekend, so I thought there'd be no harm in getting hella stoned on my last night. It was a cool night. Bright stars, but no moon, and unusually quiet. You couldn't even hear any cars in the distance on the highway, just the sounds of Teddy's walking and the faint jingling of the metal tag on his collar. I was really enjoying myself, and really savoring my joint. Probably the most pleasant walk of my stay. And then we got to the empty house. Teddy stopped dead in his tracks and refused to walk past it. He got all stubborn and wouldn't move, no matter how much I yanked on his leash. I finally had to pick him up to walk him past the house. And then I noticed it. There was a light dancing around inside the house. There were no curtains or blinds on any of the windows. Remember, nobody lived there. So I could see right in. It looked like someone with a flashlight prowling around the house, walking up and down stairs. The light of the flashlight was bluish, like it had one of those LED bulbs in it, and bright. I never saw who was holding the light, only the beam of the light itself. Like I said, it looked like a prowler inside the house, looking for something. Like, looking for stuff to steal. But it was an empty house. There'd be nothing to steal from it. There was one other odd detail. Sometimes the light would cast a shadow on the walls, like the shadow of a couch or a bookshelf or a dining room chair. But there was no furniture in the house to cast a shadow. And once, just for a split second, I thought I could see the shadow of a very tall man. I squeezed Teddy tight and ran all the way back to the professor's house. I didn't realize, until I was struggling to unlock the front door, that I still had a fat, half-smoked doobie hanging from my lips. I realize now that I should have called the police. But for one thing, I wasn't sure that I'd actually seen a crime. Or at the very least, I'd caught someone, squatting in the empty house. If you'd been there, you would have been frightened too. But When I tried to describe what happened in words, it sounded underwhelming. Hardly something the police needed to get involved in. On top of that, I started to get paranoid about my weed and didn't want to go anywhere near the cops. I was afraid I'd either get busted for possession or they'd think I was having some sort of hallucination from smoking weed. Which, weed doesn't work like that. So I split the difference and told my professor what happened. Almost the way it happened, minus the fat joint I'd smoked. He listened patiently to my story about how I thought there'd been some kind of home invasion at the empty house. He was nodding his head the whole time until I was done speaking. Then, he said he'd heard familiar stories from the neighbors and that, yes, there was a home invasion at that house. About 3 years ago. He said a family, a general contractor and his wife, who was a nurse, I think he said, and their teenage son and daughter lived there. He said he'd see them all the time whenever he was out with Teddy. One night, someone broke into their home. When the police arrived, they found the mother and the 2 kids dead in their beds. Gunshots to the head. All 3. They also found the dad. He'd been shot on the stairs holding a hunting rifle, presumably in pursuit of the intruder. There was a trail of blood to suggest that the dad had wounded the intruder with the rifle, but no one ever found a body. And the identity of the killer remains a mystery. The house has been on the market ever since.
I was 22 at the time, just got out of college with a bachelor's in theater. I'd gotten myself a job as a performer at Dollywood. There are horror movies of a very different kind to be told about that experience. I was a singer, dancer, jazz, tap, folk, and hip-hop, and actor. I was a triple threat. So I lived in Sevierville, Tennessee with a roommate who also had a Dollywood gig. Dollywood is smack dab in the middle of what some call the Redneck Riviera. It's in Pigeon Forge, which is nothing but attractions and country music stuff. Gatlinburg, the next town over, is more attractions, shops, restaurants, and skiing. Sevierville's on the other side, and it's nothing but outlets and fireworks emporiums. Most folks only see the parts of these towns that tourists are meant to see, but if you live there, it's a different experience. You know all the less traveled roads and live your lives in places tourists never go. I hear Venice, Italy is similar, with a hidden city just beneath the surface, but I digress. Whenever I had some time off, I like to go take long walks at this little park. Again, one of these places where tourists never go. It was connected to a church or a school, I never figured out which, and had a playground with a little gravel path going around it in a little circle. It wasn't quite a track, but it meandered through some trees and made for a pleasant walk or jog. So I got up just before dawn and drove out to the park for a walk. It was a crisp morning in the springtime. We'd had some rain the previous day, and everything was misty and wet. Parked my car in a gravel lot on a bank overlooking the park. It was just misty enough that I could only see vague impressions of the brightly colored playground equipment. Oh, and I forgot to mention, there were no other cars parked in the lot. So I get out of the car and started walking down the path. Like I said earlier, the path was more or less the shape of a donut, going around the outside of the playground. About a lap in, I noticed a figure standing a couple yards from where I was parked. Now, I hadn't heard another car pull up, so I just assumed he'd walked over from a cluster of condos adjacent to the wooded edge of the park. Didn't think nothing of it. People are always walking their dogs at odd hours. In fact, there was a dog sniffing around in some brush a couple steps away from him. It was still too misty to make out his features, but I walked on by without speaking to him. Next lap, he's standing just at the edge of the park, and the sun had risen enough to evaporate a lot of the mist. As I came around that time, I could see him more clearly. I'd say he was a dude in his 40s, slim to medium build, olive complexion, and dark hair that was kind of greasy and mussed up like he just rolled out of bed. 5 o'clock shadow, wearing old dirty blue coveralls and steel-toed work boots that looked about a size too big. I figured him to be a mechanic or something. Definitely appeared out of place for this park at this hour. He carried a rust-colored water bottle, like one of those big Nalgene bottles. This was all odd, but I still didn't think too much of it. You throw a rock in Tennessee, you're bound to hit somebody in coveralls. So I passed again without either of us speaking. But as I walked by this time, he fell in behind me. Not close, but moving at what you'd call a deliberate pace. At this point, the rational part of my brain was telling me this was just a guy off for a stroll with his dog. Nothing sinister about it. But a more primitive part of my brain told me to get moving. So I told my rational self I'd do one more lap and head to the car. I told my primitive self that I'd be real quick about it. I guess you'd say I started speed walking. So I stepped onto the wooded bend that marked the midpoint of the lap. I was now about an equal distance from my car in either direction. I saw a shape emerging from one of the trees. It was this guy's dog. The last time I'd seen this dog, it was sniffing around near the parking area. I had no idea how it had gotten to this end of the path without me seeing. This dog was a mutt, but pretty big. I'd say he had a little German shepherd and a lot of traveling salesmen in him. It was a strange looking dog. Not just because it was a mixed breed, but because of the meat. You see, at first this dog looked injured. Bloody cuts and wounds, all kinds of bloody gore on him. But the dog was perfectly fine, healthy. It was covered in raw meat. It looked like it had ground beef, ground lamb, and thin, streaky strips of something looking like bacon or prosciutto matted into its coat. And this dog had an odor like a broken refrigerator full of rancid cold cuts. Now how the does a dog get covered in raw meat? And wouldn't the dog just try to eat it off if he was? Before I could even think about the unsettling way the dog was looking at me, the man in the blue coveralls appeared right at my shoulders and said, "Thirsty?" We were both still walking. I was trying to put distance between me and the dog, but Blue Coveralls was keeping up my pace. He held out his water bottle to me. Now I could see that the water bottle wasn't brown or rust-colored. It was the water itself. I must have made a face because next he goes, "It's okay, see?" and started pouring the liquid from the bottle onto his mouth without actually drinking it. I mean, what the actual Now my primitive brain took over completely, and I started sprinting towards the car, not staying on the path, just cutting straight through the park using the fastest route between point A and point B. The man didn't follow me. At least that's what I thought. Instead, he just shouted the dog's name. It was a single syllable like Shep or Chet or Kip. And then the dog took off after me. I don't know how I did it, but cousin, that dog could move. But I made it to the car before the dog could pounce on me. I locked all the doors and started the engine. When I looked up, the man was standing just about 6 inches away from the driver's side window. The dog was at his side. And he just looked at me and said, "By God, you better have somebody with you." I threw the car in reverse and didn't worry about anybody's toes. As I was backing out, I saw the man stick out his tongue and pour the brown liquid onto it, still not actually drinking it, just letting it trickle down his chin and the front of his dirty coveralls. A girl I worked with at Dollywood, she'd been mugged a couple months earlier, convinced me to file a police report. The officer I spoke to told me that the man in blue coveralls matched the description of a person of interest in a number of missing persons cases. All of them boys aged 16 to 22. This officer told me, unofficially, off the record, that one of the missing boys turned up dead. Theory was he'd been abducted, drugged, raped, and asphyxiated. Bruising about the eyes and mouth. Bite marks were all over the body, as though he'd been chewed on by a dog. This officer told me I was awfully lucky I'd gotten away from this man.
I can never tell how much of this story is my true, unaltered memory of that day. I think maybe I wanted to believe I had imagined the whole thing, like some sort of sick fever dream. But it happened. All things considered, I had a pretty happy childhood. I grew up in rural Alabama with 4 sisters and 2 loving parents. Now, my daddy was the definition of an outdoorsman. Camping, fishing, canoeing, you name it. But his real passion was hunting. He hunted mostly small game. Foxes, raccoons, that sort of thing. He was a great father. Never missed my older sister's ballet recitals, and was always a good sport with participating in princess tea parties and at-home fashion shows. I guess you could say my older sisters were all on the super girly side. And then there was me, the youngest of 5 girls and not the least bit like a princess. I was the one who played in the mud and climbed trees and was never seen without some new bump or scrape from my many adventures. So, naturally, I became Daddy's little helper. Now, I wasn't big on hunting. I always felt bad about hurting animals. And the first time I went out with him, I cried over a raccoon all the way home. But what I did love was the dogs. Daddy always had about 6 dogs, a mix of coonhounds and foxhounds, and a dog lot next to the shed where we kept the tractor. If anybody ever asked how many hunting dogs he had, he'd answer, "I've got some bitches and some sons of bitches." Whenever he got him a new one or one of the bitches had pups, I'd get to help train them. There was one I loved more than all the others. His name was Whisper. We'd had him since he was a pup, when my uncle gave him to me for my 9th birthday. He was a lemon and white beagle, fast as lightning and as silent as his name. Well, until he treed a raccoon or started running a deer. Then he had the awfulest mouth on him you've ever heard. It was a cool autumn morning when we took him out to the woods. There was a patch out there where Daddy would hang raccoon feeders, both to check how thick the woods were with game and to lure game into the spot to be hunted later. And me and him would go hike out there in the daytime to check on how full the feeders were and refill them if we needed to. Sometime we'd take one of the dogs and see how he'd hunt. Whisper was already trained up, and so I guess we must have taken him because I liked his company. Mama and Daddy had argued that morning, so maybe I wanted Whisper along with me because the argument had upset me. It was years later when I learned why Mama was so upset. She'd told Daddy not to take me out that morning. It was because people began to go missing. And this was well documented in the local papers, but of course, I didn't read the paper back then. It started with 1 or 2 hikers towards the tail end of the summer, and then 3 more the first week of fall, and then 2 deer hunters that same week. No bodies were ever found. The people just vanished, like they'd never existed. Just about everybody chalked it up to people just getting lost, Daddy included. It was mostly out-of-towners who probably bit off more than they could chew. My uncle swore it was the bears getting more active. but Mama was convinced it was foul play. Or, if she'd have some blackberry shine, the work of a haint. I never got the full details of their argument that morning, but suffice it to say that Daddy convinced her we'd be safe. So there we were on a crisp fall morning, just me, my daddy, and Whisper. Daddy sent Whisper up ahead of us, and sure enough, within 5 or 10 minutes, we heard him barking several yards in the distance, just over a little ridge, barking like he'd treed something. We listened a minute, and then I took off after Whisper. I could barely hear Daddy calling my name over Whisper's barking and the pounding of excitement that filled my ears. I went deeper and deeper into the woods until I realized that my dog began to sound further and further away. I remember wondering if I scared off the game in my excitement, and Whisper took off after it. Then I heard something else, the soft crunching of leaves underfoot. I froze in place. The hairs on the back of my neck began to stand up on end, the way they do when you can feel someone's eyes on you. I spun around searching for some sign of life and realized in the process how turned around I had gotten. I was completely lost. That's when I saw him. A figure stood about 10 feet away, watching me. He was up in a tree, either sitting on a branch or in a tree stand. I couldn't make out his face, but I felt that something was off. I heard something in the man's hand make a clicking sound. Just then, someone snatched me from behind. I screamed and tugged a minute before realizing it was Daddy. He told me I ought not run away like that. Then he pointed out the bear trap at my feet that I'd almost stepped in. Daddy set me down away from the trap, and I turned around to find that the figure up in the tree was gone. I tried to shrug it off and convince myself that I had imagined it. Daddy sent Whisper out again, and this time we both went together once he started barking. We found him a little way up the trail, deep in some thorny bush, barking at a foxhole. But then he stopped. I will never forget what happened next. Whisper began to growl and looked right at me. Without warning, he came charging at me and knocked me to the ground. Me and Daddy didn't have time to react because just then an arrow came shooting my direction, barely grazing Whisper's side. I saw a gout of my dog's blood and the arrow sticking up out of the ground next to me, but Whisper didn't even flinch. He stared out into the distance without ever once blinking and growling like a demon. Daddy looked over to where Whisper was growling and he went pale. He held up his rifle in the same direction and told me to get up and hide behind him. I did as I was told, and Whisper followed, creating sort of a living barrier between me and whatever tried to shoot me down. Slowly, shaking, and not wanting anything more than to run away, I looked up in the direction they were watching. At first I saw what looked like a deer blind. That's a sort of shelter hunters use to conceal themselves from game. Then I looked closer. You ever see one of those pictures that the longer you stare at it, the more things you find that are just wrong or off? This was sort of like that. What seemed like a normal blind at first quickly changed into something wrong, something off, just like the man I'd seen up in the tree. Bones lined the beams that held the shelter up in the air, or at least it looked like bones to me. The figure from before stood just barely visible inside, with a compound bow pointing right at me. When I looked beneath the shelter, I saw heads. Heads on wooden spikes, 7 of them. Or, anyways, they did look like heads to me, and I believed they were heads when I saw them. I still do. I wanted to holler for help, but the sound got stuck in my throat. That's when Daddy told me to start walking away real slow and quiet. Then before I knew what was happening, Daddy gathered me up in his arms and he slung his rifle on his back and caught me in midair. I never seen him move so fast before in my life, and never once since. I don't remember much of what happened next. I hid my face in Daddy's shoulder as he ran faster than I ever thought him capable of running. Whisper ran ahead of us, somehow guiding us down the safest and quickest path back to the truck in spite of his injury. Daddy didn't stop running until we reached the truck door. He threw me in and Whisper jumped right in after, settling in on my lap. The engine of that old truck turned over and we took off towards the police station like a bat out of hell. Not much happened after that. The police filed a report and went out to the woods to investigate. They found a deer blind that had been torn down, and they found blood, but no heads. Some of it was dog blood, presumably from Whisper, but some of it was human, from as many as 7 individuals. We got Whisper patched up, and from that day on, he never left my side, and I never left his. He died at the ripe old age of 14. He was such a good boy. And as for me and Daddy, well, we stuck to fishing after that.
Welcome to Brew Crime, a true crime and beer podcast.
This is a podcast where we pick a theme, cover a few cases, and pair them with craft beer.
Join me, Mike.
And me, JT.
As we explore the world of crime, conspiracies, or whatever catches our attention. You can find us on social media at Brew Crime or our website, brewcrime.com. And you can find us on any podcast app at Brew Crime Podcast.
Join us as we discuss the horrible crimes that surround us and maybe, definitely tip a bottle or two back as you do it. Drink with us the second and last Tuesday of every month.
Hi, I'm Courtney Fenner, and along with my co-host Amanda Cronin,
Hey,
we are a Nefarious Nightmare.
we are a podcast that covers true crime, the paranormal, weird unsolved mysteries, and all with a personal approach and a sense of humor.
We also end our podcast with good life advice, such as wear deodorant or don't be a Richard.
Courtney and I have covered cases such as the Baker Hotel in Mineral Wells, Texas, and the tragic death of little Sharon Matthews.
We've also covered the case of Gloria Ramirez, who was, very unfortunately, dubbed the toxic lady in the media. And also, in episode 1, we have an interview with Jason Vukovich, the Alaskan Avenger, and his sister, Angelina.
So let's all gather around the bonfire and roast serial killers and marshmallows.
Yes, come on in.
You can find us on Spotify, Apple Podcast, Audible, pretty much anywhere you find really great podcasts.
Thank you guys so much for listening, and welcome to a Nefarious Nightmare.
Hello, and welcome to Cause of Death. My name is Jackie Moranti. I've been studying infectious disease for 14 years in various research settings. I have a Bachelor's of Science from Colorado State University in microbiology, immunology, and virology. I've worked with diseases like tuberculosis, SARS-1, and SARS-CoV-2, better known as COVID-19, and I've worked with EHV1. It's my feeling that if we look back at the pandemics of the past, we may be able to better handle the pandemics of the future. The problem is, we have to learn our lessons first. Come along with me while I tell you about the pandemics, the epidemics, and the outbreaks, and how we never seem to learn our lesson.
I'm Edward October. For more true-ish, and classic tales of horror and the paranormal, subscribe to our YouTube channel. Be sure to ring the bell so you don't miss anything. Or find all of our links at octoberpodvhs.com. Octoberpod, retro horror for bold individualists.